Today's stop on our journey to discuss, debate, and explore ideas of nationalism is one of our best. We sat down with Yuval Levin, founder and editor of National Affairs magazine and director of social, cultural, and constitutional studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Yuval is the author of numerous best-selling books. His most recent is A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. We are pleased to bring you this conversation with Yuval Levin, recorded in summer 2020. So Yuval, we had the chance as part of our research to view some of the videos of the speeches made at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C. last year. And your speech about Edmund Burke was not only, I think, powerful for people who were in the room and who watched the video, but it was cited quite widely by people because I think your discussion of Burke provides some of the clear philosophical foundation for how we might think about nationalism as a way to make people's lives better, which I think is a connection that's not always made. So perhaps we could begin with a discussion about Burke and how he's influenced your thinking about nationalism.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think the basic impetus for that speech was just the sense that nationalism means a lot of things, and people are using the term as though it has one agreed meaning, and we're arguing about whether we like it or not. When in fact, I think the concept stands for several different sorts of ideas. One familiar one is just nationalism as a particularly intense kind of patriotism. And surely that's one thing people mean by nationalism, just a love of country. But nationalism also involves a way of thinking about the world and thinking about politics that, on the one hand, can speak to a concern for national character. I think this is the way in which nationalism sometimes intersects with the immigration debates, the question of whether the character of a society is being undermined by immigration only really makes sense if you think there is such a thing as the character of a society. And certainly some people in our politics do. Nationalism can also be a way of organizing our thinking about politics, whether the concept of the nation should be the organizing principle of international politics or of domestic politics. I pointed to Burke in that talk because I think Burke was very clear-headed about these different kinds of recourse to the nation. The nation is a very important idea in Burke's thinking. The most significant of his political statements have a lot to do with national character. His argument about the danger that the French Revolution posed was framed as an argument about British national character. If you look at the reflections on the revolution in France, the greatest of his statements, I think, about the French Revolution, it's really an argument about the character of the British. A lot of what he had to say about the Americans in the course of the American Revolution years in the late 1770s, early 1780s, is about America's national character. Those famous speeches of his have a lot to do with why the Americans think about politics the way they do. And he offers us a way of understanding these distinctions that I thought could just help to highlight the debates we're having now. And I think that there is a case, certainly, for nationalism as patriotism. There's a certain case for nationalism as rooted in an idea of national character, though I think in America, that national character is open to a classically liberal way of thinking about politics that isn't always how nationalists approach politics in our country. And it certainly helps us think about the place of the nation in international affairs and in domestic affairs, which in the United States means arguments about federalism and localism on the one hand, and arguments about the international order on the other. And I thought that breaking it down into these categories could help us understand what it is we're talking about when we speak about the nation, and why a term that is so inherently offensive to some people can strike others not only as inoffensive but as very useful and very constructive.
Yeah. In your most recent book, A Time to Build, you write about American institutions and how they've degenerated into platforms of performance rather than bodies to provide character formation. And you make an argument that institutions should have a moral purpose. How, in your view, do you see that argument perhaps being in tension with commitments to markets and whether, kind of traditional free market economics or free market conservatism, is that necessarily in tension with commitments to family, faith, community, and country? That has shaped, I think, a lot of the internal debates in the conservative movement in the United States recently. And I think you provide a practical perspective on that when we think about how that might affect the institutions that we build.
Well, I think the idea of tension is actually very important as a way of thinking about this question. Tension can be constructive, tension can be enduring, and so tension doesn't have to mean a destructive contradiction. I think there is a tension between the ethic of the market, which is an ethic that advances both a kind of radical individualism and a prioritization of economic concerns, naturally, and the ethic of family and community and tradition that is so central to the conservative way of thinking. Now, that tension does not mean that these two are opposites or that they're enemies. And I think that there, too, it's actually worth thinking about Burke and his time, because Burke was a Smithian, an Adam Smithian. He was a personal friend of Adam Smith, but more than that, he was an admirer of his way of thinking about economics and about society. And I think what he saw was that although there must be this tension, the tension can be resolved by understanding that economics is one facet of the life of a society. It is not the totality of it. And so my sort of response to the tensions we're seeing on the right now is that I think the argument is too materialistic. We are treating the debates within the right as though they are arguments about economics, when in fact I think they're debates about how to prioritize the economic in relation to other important goods in society, like family and community, like the dignity of the individual, like the solidarity of a society or a nation. These things are all important. They don't always all point in the same direction. There are tensions between them, and our politics exists to address those tensions. Not to end them, which I don't think we can do, but to find ways of sustaining some balance. I think that's what conservatism really does for a free society, is find that balance between individualism and solidarity, between prosperity and actual human thriving and human dignity. These things can coexist, but for them to coexist requires a functional political life that enables a society to prioritize good things. And I think that's what we should expect of our politics. So I do think there's a tension. There's a tension between an ideal that says prosperity matters most, the material matters most, the individual matters most, and an ideal that says that ultimately human flourishing requires community, requires solidarity, requires tradition and religion. These things aren't just the same. Fusionism isn't really, I think, the right way to think about what it is we're looking for. We're looking for balance, and conservatism ought to be in search of that balance. I do think our debates have lost sight of that some, the internal debates of the right in America.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some on the right have presented nationalism as a way of protecting that traditional moral order from, maybe a bit dramatic language, but kind of the tyranny of the markets, right? That if we don't have some sort of nationalism to protect a culture, then globalization will, will run wild on the working class and the poor, and we'll wind up with this global system that is run by elites who have no loyalty or connection to people who are not part of that elite class. Is Do you think that there's any is that a legitimate argument? Do you think nationalism holds that promise, or is it is I assume you would argue it's more than just a rhetorical device, but how much substance and how much promise is in that idea?
Yeah. Well, I think that there is, as I say, this tension between the market and tradition. Nationalism is a way to think about how to resolve that tension only to the extent that it enables us to draw on our own common history as a resource. And in the United States, that common history is a history of living with this tension. The American tradition is a liberal tradition, a classically liberal tradition, but it's not simply liberalism. It's the life of a society that has always had a market economy. Unlike many societies, American society from the very beginning has always been a market economy, but has also been a society committed to tradition, rooted in religion, and a society that has seen itself as strong when it comes to institution building. I would put it this way. I think the political theory that Americans have had to explain ourselves to ourselves is very liberal and very individualistic. The actual practice of political life in America has always been very communal and very institutional. And that tension is a reality of American life, and it always has been. I think you've always seen it, certainly on the American right, where there have been moments where the right has emphasized tradition and solidarity. There have been moments when the right has emphasized innovation and market economics. I think we're living now in a time when that tension is very real. To me, though, it only makes sense to call our handling that tension nationalism if we're doing it in a way that takes account of our history and that draws on that history. I would love to do that. I just don't think that what's being called American nationalism always does do that. There are times when it reaches for something more like a European-style right-wing tradition, which I actually think is very much in tension with American nationalism because it's very much in tension with American history. So I think our history provides us with a lot of resources to address this tension, but that means having much more patience with classical liberalism than some of my friends who think of themselves as nationalists on the right are inclined to have. And so maybe nationalism isn't quite the term they're looking for a lot of the time.
And do you see your call to in some ways rediscover the importance of institutions in our communities as an alternative to thinking about global institutions or international institutions? Or do you see these, the rebuilding of American institutions as not necessarily competing with other kinds of institutions that influence economics and politics right now?
I do think there's a tension there. I think that the nation is probably ultimately going to be the largest or broadest possible institutional framework for a human society. I am very, very skeptical of multinational institutions because I do think that there is such a thing as the nation and a national character, and that a global order of peace is best maintained when nations are strong and confident. I think that our experiments with multinational organizations have not been successful, and that there's a reason for that, that ultimately the way we think about human thriving begins from local and interpersonal institutions, especially from family and community, builds up gradually toward higher levels of affinity that almost have to arrive at their political completion in the form of the nation. Now, there are human affinities, right? There are things that connect us and unite us as human beings across national boundaries. But I think that the political only makes sense if it is somehow bounded. And it seems to me that in the modern world, national boundaries are the logical way to do that. So yes, my way of thinking about institutions is very skeptical of multinational institutions, which I think ultimately are just too far from the sources of human flourishing to really allow for a political order to cohere.
Yeah, and I want to dig a bit further into the idea of the institution. So we've interviewed Michael Lind, for example, as part of this research project, and one of the things he talks about is the need for institutions that can provide a more amplified and stronger voice for the working class. And the kind of institution he writes about, he talks about churches, he talks about labor unions. I think the common thread between the institutions he believes can be helpful is that they are membership based, where working class men and women, either pay dues or feel some ownership over this institution, like, unions and churches may have been 60, 70 years ago. Do you see that kind of institution being the necessary step to advance some of what you would see as good politics in America, or do you have a different view of what kind of institution might make a difference?
Well, so I certainly agree with Michael up to a point. He is very materialistic in the way he thinks about political life. And so to him, the purpose of these institutions really is ultimately about organizing economic relations. I think there's much more than that going on, though I do agree that his kind of interpersonal institutions, his examples of the union and the church and the political party, are enormously important to the thriving of human communities. But I think that there are other kinds of facets too. The way I define institutions, and that's an important piece of the argument of this latest book, A Time to Build. I define institutions as the durable forms of our common life, the shapes, the structures of what we do together. They're the reason why we're not just clumps of individuals, but are groups of people ordered by common purposes. And those purposes can be economic, they can be political and social, but they can also be educational, they can also be familial and traditional, they can be political in the broadest sense, and those are all institutions. I think they're all essential institutions. And in one sense, what unites them is that they're formative of the individuals within them. I think institutions are not just ways of organizing individuals. They're not just ways of channeling preferences to make them more powerful, which at times is what Michael seems to be saying they are. I think they're also formative. They're ways of shaping the human individual to be capable of exercising freedom. That's what our families do. It's what our religious communities do. It's what our political institutions do. It's what our educational institutions, ideally, do. And so I think that broader sense of their purpose would allow for a broader notion of what kinds of institutions can serve, whether it's the working class or whether it's the larger society. And I do think that there has to be some interpersonal element to them, because in order to be formative of the individual, they have to give each person a role, a place, a relation to others. And certainly those most local institutions do that best and draw us out of our isolation, out of the loneliness that has characterized this time. But I think that does allow for a broader range of functional institutions than just the ones that serve the economic interests of one class or another.
Yeah, I think the conversation about the different types of institutions that you write about, whether it's churches or families or civic organizations, I mean perhaps it is in the character of conservatives to kind of lament and to wish things were as they may have been in yesteryear. And I think a lot of the conversation about institutions seems like it's a revival project. Like, things were better before, and we want to get the same institutions to be more influential. I'm a Christian, and that characterizes so much of the conversation that churches have, for example. But I'm quite skeptical about revival being the mission here, as opposed to just thinking about institutions being different and new, and just especially with technology, just thinking about how they could look completely different than anything we've seen before. Do you see this as a revival project? And in terms of people who may be doing things innovative, do you see signs of positive progress where you say this is an institution that's adapting to the 21st century needs of America?
Yeah. I'd say a couple of things. I am very wary of nostalgia, which isn't the same thing as thinking in terms of revival, but it is certainly a way of thinking that says the purpose of our efforts should be to restore a prior form of social order. I just don't think that's plausible. I don't think it's how free societies work. It's not my kind of conservatism at all. In a prior book called The Fractured Republic a few years ago, I took up this question of nostalgia, which I think is enormously powerful and distorting as a force in American life now. Both parties, in different ways in our politics, are intensely nostalgic for the post-war moment, the post-World War II moment, where the left tends to wish that we could have the economic arrangements of that period, strong unions, a large, confident government working with big corporations to run things. The right tends to pine for the cultural arrangements of that period, a very strong mainstream consensus around a kind of vaguely Christian ideal that enabled a kind of traditionalist consensus to hold. I think, first of all, our understanding of that period is distorted by this nostalgia. It wasn't so great. It wasn't so great if you weren't white. It wasn't so great if you were in a minority community. And in any case, it was a function of a set of circumstances that is not recoverable and that we shouldn't really want back. What we could try to work toward, though, is not exactly recovery, but renewal. And I think renewal is different from nostalgia. The idea that we should want to be forward-looking, future-oriented, constructive, is, I think, essential to any functional politics. That we would miss that about post-war America, which was forward-looking and future-oriented and constructive. I think that makes sense. The question for us is how do we achieve that now, given the society that we are, given the experience that we've had, given the circumstances that we're living with. And it seems to me that kind of renewal is a combination of recovery and construction. And I think that building institutional strength is not just a matter of recovering the strength of weakened institutions. It is also a matter of building new institutions to deal with new problems and new circumstances. And there is room for that in American life now. There's a need for that. We should be living in an era of institution building, but we're not. And I think the sheer weight of that nostalgia, and frankly, the cultural power of the baby boomers who embody that nostalgia is just a yearning for their own youth, makes it very difficult for us to think about the future. Our politics in America now is very bad at thinking about the future. We see everything through the lens of the older baby boomers. Donald Trump was born in June of 1946. George W. Bush was born in July of 1946. Bill Clinton in August of 1946. A huge number of our leaders in the last several decades have come from that moment, from the very beginning of the baby boom. And our entire cultural memory is rooted in their experience. It makes it very hard for us to think about the future. It leaves younger generations feeling like they missed the height of the American project and now they're just picking up the pieces. And none of that needs to be true. So I think we need to get beyond nostalgia not by forgetting our roots, but by trying to build on the foundations that exist for us. And a forward-looking conservatism is the only plausible and worthwhile kind, in my mind.
Yeah, is there anyone you think is doing that particularly well right now?
Well, look, I think we're witnessing a generational change in a lot of ways in our politics, so that on the right, there definitely is an increasingly self-confident younger generation, younger than me, frankly. I'm 43, I'm sort of middle generation, that is, I think, rising and saying, we're not just going to clean up after the boomers. What are we going to do? How are we going to build the world we want to live in? I think that some of the generational transition in elected politics will be constructive in that way. We are about to have an election between a man who's 74 and another who's 78. That's not ideal for a forward-looking democracy. But I think that that's not going
Yeah.
to continue forever. And there is a generation of people on the right who are a little bit more in my generation, people like Tom Cotton, or Josh Hawley, Marco Rubio, Mike Lee. These are people in their 40s, generally speaking, and they're much more comfortable with 21st century America. I do think they look ahead and think about the future. Some of them are very much in a kind of nationalist mindset. Some of them are more traditional Reaganite conservatives. Some of them are somewhere in the middle. And the kinds of conversations they're inclined to have, I think, are more constructive for us than what we've been living through for a while. And in some ways, the same thing needs to happen on the left. I mean, the left is also deeply nostalgic. Their primary ended up with a fight between a 77-year-old and a 78-year-old. And their boldest policy idea is to put for all at the end of every Great Society program. I just don't think we've seen the generational transition that we need to see, but it is clearly coming, and so I do have some hope for the future here.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I know you'd mentioned the fractured republic earlier, and I'm curious to know. I believe it came out in 2016, before Trump had become the president. And I would say, given what we see in the news right now, the title of your book and a lot of the arguments you make seem quite prophetic for how things would play out over the course of his first term. Do you have any, has anything surprised you about how fractured America has seemed? And do you see it getting any better anytime soon?
Well, look, anybody who claims to have lived through the last 4 years in America without being surprised
Yeah.
isn't telling you the truth. So a lot has surprised me, yes. The book was written really before Trump was the Republican nominee, or before it was clear that he would be, let alone before he was president. I actually had a little discussion in that book about Trump, and my editor at Basic Books persuaded me to take it out on the premise that by the time the book came out, later in 2016, it would seem strange to be talking about this guy who was just in the primaries for a little while and then faded away. And of course, I said, yeah, that makes sense. So I don't claim to have been prophetic about any of that. I do think that what we saw in 2016 and have seen since, is certainly in one sense a working out of the deep divisions that have been embodied in our politics in this century, in the 21st century. And that we have seen those continue to deepen and work themselves out. I've been unhappy with the president. I didn't support him, and I don't. I think we had an election that didn't give us any plausible choice. That didn't give us anyone worthy of being president, and unfortunately, I think we're headed to another such election now. But I do think that we have seen some of these tensions become more explicit and be taken up more directly by our politics in ways that could turn out to be healthy. We're actually arguing now about what we want our priorities to be, about what the sources of our divisions are. I think it's clearer now that we're living in a period of isolation and alienation. That we require a politics of solidarity, not just a politics of liberty, which was part of the argument of that book. I think in some ways both parties do see that now, and our politics is more directed to that question now. But look, the book that came after that, A Time to Build, was really directed to the question of, well, what do you do? Given that we are a fractured society, how do we begin to reconnect and rebuild? And the answer to that, it seems to me, has to be rooted in a sense of institutionalism. What our institutions do, what they are for, what we should expect of the people who run them. And it seems to me that by thinking about what we should be building, we can turn in a more constructive direction and not just criticize and not analyze from a distance, but understand that this kind of project is going to take insiders, not just outsiders, people who want to take some ownership and responsibility over the future of their society. I think there are such people. I hope that they come to the fore. But there's no question the last few years of our politics have been pretty damn depressing.
Yeah, that's for sure. In closing, I'd like to ask, the conference that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, National Conservatism. I'm just curious, do you identify as a nationalist or as a national conservative? Where does nationalism fit into how you perceive your own politics?
Well, I'm a conservative, and I don't really feel the need for a qualifier. I think nationalism has served the role of a qualifier for people who are looking for for the right qualifier for this moment and haven't quite found it. I don't think it's going to end up being nationalism. I think it's a little bit more like a populist conservatism, but that's not quite the right modifier either. I just don't find myself in need of a modifier. I think what conservatives offer a free society begins from a sense that human beings are fallen and imperfect, that we require institutions to form us to be free, but that we're also created in a divine image and deserving of dignity and respect as individuals. And that tension between a certain kind of individualism and a certain kind of solidarity is the tension that keeps free societies alive. Conservatives exist to conserve it and to try to build on the institutions that enable us to keep our balance amid that tension. And that's where I am. I'm a conservative. I'm patriotic. I love my country, and to the extent that that's what nationalism means, I'm happy with that. I also think that the nation is the right organizing principle for international politics, and if that's what nationalism means, fine. I don't think the nation is the best organizing principle for our domestic politics. In that sense, I'm much more of a localist, so that if nationalism means centralization, then that's not for me. And ultimately, it seems to me that the confusion over that term means that maybe it's just not the best way to organize how we think about contemporary politics. And to me, the way to signify where I stand is just a conservative.